Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Bob Findora, one of the school counselors at Unionville High School. Welcome to the college planning webinar here. We have a very unique situation tonight and have some parents and some students in here. I'm going to give it another minute here. As we can see, some of the participants are really filling in here as we get things started. So I'll give another minute and we'll have everything up and running. And thank you very much for all of you for your participation tonight. And we'll go through what this webinar is going to look like a little bit before we get started. All right. As individuals are starting to join the webinar here, I'm going to start things off. If you just signed up here and joined in, again, my name is Bob Findora. I am one of the school counselors at Unionville High School. I help facilitate a lot of these webinars. I appreciate all the participation. I appreciate the positive feedback we've received about these webinars over the last few years. As all of you've noticed here in the community, especially those of you with multiple children, we're constantly changing these webinars. We're constantly making adjustments to meet the needs of the community and see how we can help individuals out. This webinar here tonight will be recorded. Usually give me a few days, and between a couple of days after this is recorded, we'll be able to get it back up and running on the college planning portion of the school counseling website. As we go through tonight for the webinar, I highly encourage those of you out in the audience, as we have more participants coming in, I highly encourage you to utilize the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You will be able to ask questions live as we start going through things here. And as those questions come in, I'll be able to facilitate some of those questions to the different members here that are participating in the parent and student panel here for tonight. So as I get started, one of the first things I'd like to do, I'd like to thank all of you first and foremost in the community. I know with the live participation allows you to ask some questions and get some of your needs met immediately. But I can't begin to tell you the number of views we have on these webinars afterwards, because I know it's difficult sometimes with some of the students and their extracurriculars, and also with some of the parents and their jobs. But, you know, if we're not participating tonight, we have a ton of participation for views afterwards. As far as how the webinar is going to run tonight, those of you that have been able to see some of the prior webinars from earlier in the year, this is going to be facilitated a little bit differently. If you haven't already noticed, we have more participants on the screen here, so I'll try to wrangle everybody in tonight and make sure we're getting all the points out. But each individual that is up on the screen here, I've been very fortunate to work with, for some of them for years, some of them a little bit more recently. And I really appreciate all of our students and all of our parents here today taking time out of their night here to sit down and help our community out and help our counseling department out. Each of them brings a very unique perspective that really helps out from a question standpoint of what we get in the counseling center. What I'd like to do, I'd like to also thank Justin Webb here. Justin's behind the scenes. He kind of runs our technology department here. He's our tech guru. He helps it out with everything and facilitates a lot of the technology portion of things, which without him, I wouldn't be able to do this. And I'd also like to thank Melissa Allbrand and Laura Elthrith behind the scenes, helping out from the counseling department to facilitate this webinar also. So, you know, without further ado here, I would like to get things started. What I'd like to do is I'm going to go around and just briefly ask each of the parents and each of the students, as I direct things towards you, just to start, if you don't mind, if you can just give a very brief background, your involvement in the college planning process, as far as if you have children that have come through, what schools are they currently going to, if you have a current senior, that what school they may be going to, and just that brief background. And then I'll do the same thing for the students here. If you've made your selections already, if you have not, kind of where are you at this point with the schools you've applied to and the schools you may potentially be going to at this point. And then as we go through, I'll start to facilitate the conversation and kind of gear things back to each of the individuals on the screen and what their particular background brings. That's extremely helpful for us tonight, okay? So first and foremost, I'd love to start with the parents, okay? Not to put too much pressure on all of you, but I'd like to start with the parents here. Mrs. Frere, if you don't mind, if I put you on the spot to start, I've been very fortunate to work with you for years and your children. If you don't mind, if you can share with us just your children and what schools they're currently going to and where they potentially might be going here in the near future.
Absolutely. So my name is Marga Ferrer. I had a son who went through UHS. Mr. Findor was his guidance counselor. Thank goodness. We had a great experience. So he is currently at Indiana University Kelley School of Business. He's a sophomore right now. So he graduated in 2021. And my daughter's a senior, Caitlin Ferrer. She just decided that she's going to Penn State, which we're really excited about. Didn't think she was going to go there, but that's where she ended up. So that's actually part of, something I would like to talk to the parents about, because you never know where your kid is going to end up, and wherever they end up, they're going to be perfectly happy.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Mrs. Ferrer. Mrs. Day, if you don't mind me switching gears here, to you, and just a little background about your family and where everybody stands at this point.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. So my name is Eileen Day. I have 3 kids in the district, an 8th grade son, a 10th grade daughter, and my oldest, Madeline, is a senior at Unionville, and she has applied. It's too many schools to list, because she applied to theater programs, and you have to cast a pretty wide net. So everywhere from North Carolina to Chicago to California to New York to Connecticut to Boston. And she is very excited. She'll be attending New York University and studying drama through the Tisch School of Arts next fall.
Perfect. Thank you, Mrs. Day. Thank you. Mrs. Ray, if you don't mind me switching gears over to you and a little bit of background, and if you could share with the community here.
Hi, thanks for coming tonight. I'm Joy Ray, and I have 2 kids in the district. My daughter graduated last year, and she's currently at Westchester University, and my son is a sophomore. And I've been teaching at Unionville for 23 years. So I've been able to kind of have a bird's eye view on the application process and the recommendation process, and all of many, many varieties of journeys and casting wide nets and where kids settle in. It's been interesting being a fly on the wall and watching this for many years.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Ray. Mary, I think I've worked with you the longest out of all the students in here, so I'm going to put you on the spot first. Mary, if you don't mind sharing just a little bit of background for the community here, and we'll keep things moving.
Hi, I'm Mary. So I'm a student athlete, and I'm going to William & Mary next year. I've been committed since March last year, and I applied in August and got in. So I only had to apply to 1 school. So it's good.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. Meg, I'll switch gears to you over here, if you don't mind sharing a little bit of your experience and where you are at this point.
Perfect. So hi, my name is Meg Harkness. I'm also a high school senior at Unionville. From my perspective, I'm a music student, so I play violin, and I'm looking to major in music education. I'm definitely thinking University of Delaware is my #1 choice right now, and also Westchester University as my second. I'm looking to decide in the next few weeks. And another thing is I actually moved to Unionville halfway through my high school career. So very excited here.
Yeah, thank you, Meg. Trust me, I'll be back to you in a little bit to bother you about that transfer experience here in a little bit. So Megan, thank you for joining us. You're a big help here tonight. So if you don't mind sharing, Megan, a little bit of schools you've applied to, where you are at this point, what does it look like for you?
Yeah, so I'm Megan Clark. I'm also a senior at Unionville High School. I'm a cheerleader. I've been at Unionville my whole life. And I applied to about 7 schools. I kept it small, but I still knew that I wanted to be somewhere in the Northeast region. I decided that I'm going to attend Widener University this fall. I'm in the 3+3 program to get my doctorate in physical therapy. So I'll spend 3 years undergrad in psychology and then 3 years of graduate school getting my doctorate in physical therapy. And I plan to minor in Spanish as well as cheer at Widener. So yeah, it's been a great process.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Appreciate it. Thank you, Megan. All right. So if everybody doesn't mind, I'll kind of switch gears just a little bit here. For those of you that just joined, I know we had a lot more participants come in within the last few minutes. I highly encourage everyone to utilize the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We'll be able to facilitate questions that come in for all of you, and make sure we have any questions answered that you may have for different members of our panel here. And if anything else that you may have, just general questions that maybe some of the panelists aren't going to touch on, I might be able to facilitate and help before we move forward. Before I get started on kind of gearing things to each individual, it's rare that I have this opportunity to talk to the community and kind of just walk them through the basics of our process. It's very difficult for our counseling department to gear a specific playbook because each student, and as you can see, each family is very different. Just from the 2-minute descriptions here, minute descriptions, each individual on this panel has been able to describe. I have so many parents that I talk to in the PTO, and I give presentations to the middle school parents, and they want that playbook. They want exactly what it should look like in 9th grade and 10th grade and 11th grade, 12th grade. It doesn't really work that way quite as much. I'll give you a brief overview quickly before we jump into things with the different individuals on the screen here. Just what we try to provide from the Counseling Center as a little bit broader perspective. Typically with students that come through in 9th grade, our focus from the counseling department is really getting them involved and really getting them to enjoy high school. Time management is a big piece of the puzzle when students are making that adjustment from middle school. So we as counselors work a lot on that, study strategies and what that looks like also to become a student at the high school level. But between our activities fair and what feels like the million activities in sports we have to offer at Unionville High School, we really encourage the students to be able to get involved in 9th grade. And that's one of our big focuses. Not too much the college planning portion of things. By 10th grade, we again, each year, each of his counselors, we meet with every single student on our caseloads. By 10th grade, we're switching gears a little bit. Now we're a little bit more focused on what are your interests for the future. We really encourage students to utilize the self-discovery tab on the Naviance program, right? Our Naviance is our career and college readiness program that we utilize for students. And that's in all over the Counseling Center website, the Naviance tab, to be able to log into that. All students have access to that. But in Naviance in the 10th grade year, we're really encouraging students to utilize these self-assessments, personality tests, career inventories, just really cool stuff to get them used to looking into their future. Also in 10th grade, we start that conversation with students about what does it look like for your 11th grade year about the playbook for the SAT and ACT? When should you take it? What is the difference between the SAT and ACT, right? And we're starting to prepare them for their 11th grade year and preparing for that. I'll talk a little bit here to Mary in a little bit, but, depending upon what sport you're involved in, unfortunately for some of them, some of the sports here, you may have to potentially take a SAT in your 10th grade year a little earlier than everybody else, because for recruiting purposes, the admissions and the coaches are going to want to get a little gauge on that. And I'll kind of talk to Mary about that in a little bit, but that's usually the playbook we're starting to go over with students in the 10th grade conference, the self-discovery tab in Naviance, and also the SAT and ACT dates. And again, depending upon the student's math, when they're taking math in particular, that may shift things around a little bit of when the students take the SAT in their junior year. And then by the time we get to the junior year, if any families have experienced this, it is a very, very important meeting that we have with the families. We sit down for about 50 minutes to an hour with parents and students in the same meeting for the junior planning conference. In that junior planning conference, we're running the gamut of just about everything that the process entails and as much details as we possibly can fit in that meeting. Some of the parents that have worked with me that are in the panel right now, and some of you out in the audience, the Counseling Center website, we house that college planning tab under the Counseling Center website, and that has a lot of information in it. What I try to do in our junior planning conference is I try to take bits and pieces of it and individualize it to the student of what's going to be appropriate and useful for them, because it is a big tab and it has a lot of information. But again, for those of you that have parents in here with 9th grade, 10th grade students, you can start to educate yourself just from that one tab, because we spent years putting that together and breaking everything down and organized for it. So junior planning conference is really starting that discussion on all of that information and what it entails. And then by the time we get into the senior year, we're meeting with the seniors individually. We have senior seminars where we as counselors go in and meet with large groups of the seniors during lunch and facilitate what do the applications look like, what's the bigger picture, timelines. We go through all of that with them during their senior year. And then we individually meet with them in their senior conferences and really break down the applications and making sure timelines are met and all the information necessary is met also. So that's, before we jumped into things, I've had so many parents kind of ask me about what's the bigger picture. And I wanted to start off with that before I start to get into a little bit more specific information. I'd actually like to start things off here because I was actually talking to Dory, to Mrs. Ray here about this. The experience itself, and I talked to Mrs. Ray about that, the idea that, you can start in one place and end in a completely different place. And the patience and what that looks like from a parent perspective, what it looks like from what your child's words they're using. Mrs. Ray, can you just talk a little bit about your experience in particular, with your oldest there, and what did that look like, and where are things now, if you don't mind sharing?
Sure. My daughter graduated last year, and so the placement of COVID, I think, had a little bit to do with some of what went on, because school shut down during her sophomore year, and when we went to go visit schools after her junior year, there was a lot that was still closed. And there were, so as we went around, and we went all the way up as north as far as Vermont, we went out to Bloomsburg, she went out to Pitt, she saw some places, but I don't know that we got the picture that we needed to get, because we didn't see the campus in action. So I think as we start to think about this for my son, who's a sophomore, one of the biggest things that I think I will do differently for him is just try to get on campuses while they're in session. And if you know someone who goes there, try to schedule it so that you can, either your child can have lunch with them or go to a class with them, and walk around while it is in session, breathing, living, the whole thing. Because I think that would have given my daughter some really strong clues that she wasn't aware of until she literally moved onto campus. So her senior year, she was in the technical high school, the teacher academy, and she knew that she wanted to be a teacher, and she's still on that path. And that was kind of that's been her guiding light the whole time. So after visiting schools and deciding what she wanted to look for, she decided to apply to Bloomsburg and Pitt, and she did not cast a very wide net. She was really intent on enjoying her senior year, enjoying her dual enrollment and her teaching internships and stuff like that. And then she wound up she didn't get into Pitt. She got deferred. And when the word came down, she didn't get into Pitt, but she got into Bloomsburg right away. So she thought, oh, all right, I'll go to Bloomsburg. Yeah. And I think she had an idea when she got on campus that Bloomsburg wasn't the fit for her. Yeah. But she didn't say anything till after we dropped her off in August, and things certainly changed. Yeah. I would say within 8 days, she was driving herself back home from Bloomsburg. Yeah. And she interviewed for jobs. She's teaching at the Ducklings in Longwood. So she's doing what she wants to do with, teaching at an age level that she hadn't tried yet. She's in a 2-year-old classroom. And she was already enrolled at Delaware County and Immaculata with her program from last year. So she jumped in with both feet and took classes last fall at Delaware County, and began the process of applying to Westchester, and was able to switch to Westchester this spring. So she's still working full time, which I did not anticipate. She's living at home, which I'm actually very, very happy about. She's nice to have around. And she's doing it. She's doing like full-time school, full-time job, but this is not, I think she refused to tour Westchester because it was too close to home. Yeah. It was one school that she flat out refused, said, I will not go to Westchester. I don't want to tour Westchester. Yeah. And she's very, very happy with what she's doing right now. Yeah, Dory, you bring up a lot of really good points, and I want to touch on a couple of them. First and foremost, that just where you left off right there. Again, I'm not I'm not plugging any particular institution, but just because Westchester comes up so often down the road here, I think any of these college admissions representatives that I talk to, they always talk about how it's tricky that no matter how popular the institution is, if it's too close to a particular high school, there's a different feel for that high school, and it's a reality of it happens everywhere. We just happen to have Westchester down the road. That's a great institution, but they talk about how that happens everywhere and continue to understand the programs that they have open. One part that you discussed here, and one part that you touched on, and one thing that I talked a lot with Mrs. Ferrer in particular about with her children, is kind of keeping that open mind when you do cast a different kind of net. Keeping that open mind when it comes to particular schools that might be close to home and farther away on top of that. Mrs. Ray, you brought up a word there that I just want to clear up for a lot of community members. You talked about your child being deferred in the process, right? And a lot of families don't necessarily know what that exactly means. Typically, when you're deferred in a process, in the application process,
a number of institutions, I'll give an example for a lot of the parents out here. A number of the institutions might have a deadline of November 1st for students to get their applications in, and they call that early action a lot of times. And that November 1st deadline, the students get their information in, and then the school and the admissions office will say, hey, as long as you meet that deadline by November 1st, we will let you know and answer by December 15th, by December 20th. Some of them let me pull my hair out and they say December 23rd, right before Christmas Eve. But the point is they'll let you know in December. Now, when they let you know, they can have their acceptance. They could essentially, deny the student at that point, or what we see sometimes is what's called being deferred. And when they defer the student, what they're looking for is that student's kind of on the bubble a little bit, and they want to get more information on how the year is unfolding for them, because it's very competitive at that point for the numbers for the admissions. So when they defer a student, they're typically going to be looking for their mid-year grades, and that usually doesn't happen until the beginning of February. So there is that waiting part of the process, that you just kind of brought up, and what your daughter went through. And from that standpoint, that could be agonizing for students, because a lot of them think, oh, I got all my applications out, now I can just catch my breath finally. And now all of a sudden it's a new waiting game that tends to happen. And Meg, I'll kind of come back to you a little bit about that, because it sounds like you're in a little bit of that at this point also. But Dory, thanks for sharing that. Mrs. Frere, if you don't mind if I switch gears over to you, because it reminds me of a somewhat similar conversations that we had in the process. I know when we started out, your children, just kind of a wide range of schools, both of them getting into much larger schools. With that part of the process, you can remember me bothering both of your children about, hey, with these very, very large schools, the Penn States, the University of Pittsburgh's, their timeline's a little bit different in applying to them. Can you speak a little bit to what that looks like, Mrs. Frere, if you don't mind?
Absolutely. So, again, we started out a traditional route with my son, Colin, who graduated in 2021. In sophomore year, we took him out to some schools, small school, big school, really kind of gravitated to a Penn State type. So as we went through junior year, we knew we were going to do large universities. Very easy with him. He wanted to do business. So we said, okay, here's the top 50 business schools. Pick whatever ones you want, because now we're in COVID. We couldn't see any of them. Yep. Yep. So, unfortunately, they have a type A mother that's, always was on top of everything. I used Mr. Findora as a psychologist a lot and say, hey, help me out here. But the reality is that we did, about 12 to 13 schools for both my children, because they didn't have a school that they wanted to go to. With Colin, it was like, all right, the best school I could get into. With Caitlin, was like, okay, I have three I like. I'll take any one of these three, which works out really well. But I will say, the summer of your, right before you go into your senior year, I would spend that summer with your child, really kind of fine tuning. These are the schools you want, because applications open in August, right? And early action, we did everything early action. The great news about early action, we were done by the middle of October. And I was like, oh, all right, enjoy your senior year. I could enjoy their senior year. But the reality is that, if your kid plays a sport, Caitlin played golf with Mary, Colin played football, it's really demanding. You have to hit these deadlines, and sports are demanding, right? And so we really started the process of writing the supplemental essays, even though you don't know exactly what they are, but just getting the concepts down. Essay writing took the longest. The applications are easy enough, but I would recommend, if your child, plays a sport, make sure you start early that summer before they go into their senior year. It really fine tuning. Okay, these are the schools that look good. Even if you haven't visited them, go on Naviance, see if you're fitting. At that point in time, you have your SAT scores, you have your GPA. Where can I fit? Is it a reach school? Is it a safety school? And let me rephrase that. I utilized Naviance a lot as we were picking schools, because you don't want to be disappointed, right? You definitely do reach and safety, but again, highly recommend doing essays over the summer. Yeah,
Mrs. Frere, that is it. That's phenomenal advice there. And what I want to tell a lot of the families in the community here, the English teachers in the student's junior year, it might vary depending upon the teacher. And I got to be careful what I say here, because my wife works in the English department here. But it depends on the teacher. They're going to, at some point before they leave high school, their junior year, they're going to have potentially up to a week, if not more, that the students in those classes spent on their college applications. Mrs. Frey, I kind of want to clarify something you brought up because it was a really nice point. Mrs. Frey brought up there the supplemental essay. So essentially what we're talking about here for families out there in the audience, you have that traditional essay that they're going to work on in their English classes, and you can look at all the faces, all the students, because they're shaking their heads and they know that they did it in all their English classes. They work on that traditional essay. That I jokingly say it hasn't changed since it feels like the beginning of time. There's some kind of prompts that are going to be based around perseverance, leadership, right? Something along those lines. That hasn't changed too much. However, the supplemental essays are very particular. Maybe not quite as long at times, but they're very, very particular. I'll give you some examples that I give to students on two ends of the spectrum. For years and years ago, University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, their supplemental prompt was just why UPenn at one point. And it's really hard for anyone to work with the student on why they would want to go to that school so badly, right? The other side I've seen of supplemental essays, University of Chicago for years comes up with just the most creative prompts they possibly can. One of them was, you have these 5 items and you're stuck on an island. What do you do next, right? And it's just kind of thinking outside the box. So you'll see that, but generally you may not see a supplemental essay for every school, and for just about all of the schools. To Mrs. Ferrer's point, you're going to see an essay, and having that under your belt before you start that process your senior year is going to save you a lot of time. The second thing I wanted to touch on that you brought up, that was a really good point, Mrs. Ferrer, starting early, right? Starting the process early there in the summertime, which can save a lot of time for seniors as they go into the beginning in the fall. I want to be clear about this because I get questions all the time. The larger schools, to Mrs. Ferrer's point, she has a lot of experience with this. These larger schools, the Penn States, the University of Pittsburgh's, they allow what's called self-reporting of their academic record. Basically meaning that they don't need me to send a transcript. They don't need a counselor to send a transcript to them. They allow the students to go into their application and put in there each class, each grade, each level. It's time consuming, but it allows the student to fill that information out, and they can start the process earlier from that standpoint. I think sometimes what some parents get a little bit antsy about, especially contacting our counseling department, they're saying, oh, we want to get everything done for all of the schools, all the way in August. There's not, high schools don't have counseling departments facilitating letters of recommendation and transcripts throughout the summers, and college admissions knows that. So your self-reporting schools, the really large schools, they're gonna be allowed to start that process earlier. The vast majority of your other schools, they're not going to really even start to look at the applications till it gets closer to that deadline, which might be early action. So just knowing the difference. And again, I don't want to confuse individuals that might be starting this process in the community. The admissions website will walk you through step by step on exactly what I'm saying for each of these individuals' institutions. They're not trying to trick you. They'll tell you exactly what they want, when they want it, and how they want it. But the last point you brought up there, Ms. Freire, is going to switch gears over to Mrs. Day here, because I remember kind of having some of these conversations, and I don't say it lightly. And, Mrs. Day, you probably remember me using these exact words because I use it with a lot of our families. One of the best ways to start to figure out this portion of things in the college process and figure out what you want and what you're looking for out of these schools. And unfortunately, for what Mrs. Ferrer brought up and Mrs. Ray brought up, the pandemic did not allow this, but it's going to be stepping on the campuses. It's time, it's resources. It could be exhausting at times. But that going on those college visits is going to be important. Mrs. Day, you mentioned about your daughter being involved in, the performing arts. If you don't mind talking a little bit about that process, because that process in itself is different than the typical application with auditions and a little bit more involved, a little more detail with the application. So Ms. Day, if you don't mind helping us out here, I'd appreciate that.
Sure. Yeah. So our experience with Maddie applying to, she applied to theater programs, but this process is probably similar for dance and music programs, any performing arts, is that you have to apply both academically and artistically. So what that means is you submit your academic application, and then you also submit pre-screen videos. So for her, that included acting monologues, singing, and sometimes dance videos. And the way it works is if she passes the pre-screens, then she would move on and be asked to audition either live or over Zoom. If not, the road would end there for that school. So what's different is that you know, for most seniors, they apply in the fall and get an answer from schools in the spring. She had this series of mini acceptances and rejections along the way. So they need a lot of encouragement on this path. And you know, these are competitive, as I mentioned earlier. And this was my first kid applying to college. She honestly, I don't mean to scare anyone, but she applied to around 20 schools, which for the performing arts track is typical.
Yes, correct.
But what I also want to say is that in addition to the pre-screens, she would have to do academic supplemental essays as any kid, but she also had supplemental essays unique to the theater program, you know, why acting, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So one of the challenges for this track as well was that some of the schools academically that she thought she was interested in originally ended up not having great theater programs. And some of the schools with great theater programs, she didn't think she would get like the academic piece that she wanted. So there was a lot of front end investigation and research on the best schools. And Mr. Fandora, you were really helpful on that end. My recommendation, I cannot say this enough, echoing what previous people have said, is start early. So Madeline was away for most of the summer at a theater program. So before she left, we really had her fine tune that main essay and try to do as much of this in kind of the spring of junior year. And then she kind of hit the ground running when she came back. Because there's a lot to do. And I guess like one of my recommendations that would work for any parent of a kid applying is we kind of had an agreement that anything that was due, whether it was a pre-screen, a supplemental, any piece, reaching out to counselors for transcripts, that we set a kind of deadline a week before they were actually due, because then they just offer time for soliciting feedback and reflecting on, you know, is this my best work? It was an involved process, but one thing I want to say for anyone considering this track is that there's an added bonus. Like, you know, the schools got to see my kid on video shining, doing what she does best and what she's passionate about. So, although it's extra work for sure, it's sort of exciting on that end.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mrs. Day. That's a great point. And I have parents ask me all the time about, you know, what is Mr. Fandor, just tell me the number of schools my child should apply to. And as everyone can see in here, there's no easy answer to that, you know, and it's really working together and collaborating as a parent and as a student on communication. And it's just so important. I find that, you know, and I start my junior planning conferences off talking about this. It's such a unique experience. And I love those meetings because it's one of these experiences where not only I, as a counselor, are able to see this child maturing and becoming more independent every single year I work with them at the high school, but obviously the parents are seeing that, and the parents are also able to take a little bit of step back and allow that independence. However, where I come back in here in the junior year is like we have to get everybody back together at this point, because at this point the student thinks they can do everything on their own. Right? The parent doesn't want it to be overbearing to make the decision for the child. And that's where a lot of times we as counselors can come in and facilitate some of those conversations. It's very helpful. So Mrs. Day, that was a great description there of a very, very particular type of programming. Along those lines, I brought in Megan Clark here to help me out, right? When we talk about particular programming, Megan, like as she mentioned earlier, you know, has a background in our TCHS programming. And Megan, if you don't mind, I'd like you to kind of describe that experience a little bit. And then Megan, also describe, as you were going through your applications, what you were looking for in the colleges, because, you know, I have a lot of students that apply in that PT, the physical therapy, the occupational therapy, the sports medicine world. And some of those programs are not just 4-year bachelors. Some of them build on top of each other. So Megan, if you don't mind describing, your experience in the process for me, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so when it comes to TCHS, I'm in the Allied Health program. It is seniors only, and it's across the board. I know in my class specifically, I have kids from Henderson, Oxford, Westchester East, Ruston, Bishop Shanahan, and I'm lucky. So the Allied Health program has 4 branches. There's hospital track, there is EMS, there's community health, and then I'm in sports medicine. And I'm lucky enough where the sports medicine is actually hosted at Unionville. So all these kids come and they block out either your first 2 periods or your last 2 periods, and you come for 2 whole periods worth to get instruction and just about anything, honestly. Like for us, it's more PT, AT based. I know other tracks they observe in the OR, they observe in hospital rooms, they like in ICUs. Like this program has honestly been such a nice guiding path for me, because we go for observation on Monday, Tuesday, and then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we go for instruction Monday, Tuesday, and observation Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So every Wednesday, Thursday, Friday right now, I'm observing at Pivot Physical Therapy. I get to see patients on a regular basis. I get to know kind of how they work with them, what they do to help people recover. I've observed before occupational therapy. I did speech therapy. I've seen it all basically, and it helped me learn that like I have a liking for pediatrics. So like it's just been such a great program for me to understand where I really want to be, because physical therapy and occupational therapy, all these therapies are such a broad aspect, and there's so many niches within it that like you get to figure out what you really like, and you get to work with your teacher about where you want to observe and if you want to observe somewhere again. And it was honestly a great guiding path for me to be on.
That's great, Megan. Thank you very much for describing it. It's such unique programming. When we talk about some of these programs building on top of each other from the college aspect, Megan brought up that TCHS program. I just want to be very clear with everyone. We have some of the information on the Counseling Center website about TCHS. You're hearing a little bit more, about some of the children, some of the parents in here, and from some of the students about senior-only programs. That's not all TCHS has to offer. If you go on the career portion of our Counseling Center website, there's a whole bunch of information on all the programming that TCHS offers. We have programming for 9th grade all the way through 10th grade into 11th, and as you heard, there's a little bit more hands-on programming in 12th grade, and even within TCHS. I don't want parents out there feeling like, oh, well, it sounds like these students, they knew the whole time what they wanted to do, and they knew exactly what program they wanted to be in, and they knew that wanted to be hands-on. I have plenty of students that get in, and that's part of the process for them. They figure out, hey, maybe this isn't for me, and they get a little bit more ahead of the ball game on what their likes and what their dislikes are. And there's a lot of flexibility there with TCHS to go through things. But essentially, with programming and some of the applications, as you can see here, we have a number of parents and a number of students talking about, what does that process look like potentially applying to a lot of schools and in the wider net and for different reasons. I talk a lot to our athletes, and I say sometimes with the recruiting process, and Mary could probably remember me saying this, it's almost, as they say, a double-edged sword in that, at times, some of our students are so academically talented and so talented in what they're involved in. It opens up so many doors for them. They don't even know where to start. When we talk about that with some of our athletes, sometimes that may narrow down a lot depending upon where they're getting recruited and at what level and what that looks like. And there's also the financial portion of things too that can get in for the different levels from Division I, working your way down from Division I, Division II, with maybe less money, and then potentially at the Division III level, still playing and competing, but not having a financial scholarship from the college at that point. Mary, I know we've talked a lot, about the process and recruiting, and we've been able to see it all since you stepped in my office in 9th grade. Can you just talk a little bit about what that perspective looks like? And again, I don't want you speaking on behalf of all athletes everywhere in every sport, but just your particular experiences in recruiting and what that looked like, and when did you take the SATs and all of that good stuff, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I've been playing competitive golf since I was like in 8th grade. And I think the high school's like golf program really got me into it even more and made me really want to pursue a college career with it. And I knew like with the level that I was at, I wanted to go for D1 schools. And so I kind of just was on my search. With tournaments and stuff, I was able to travel around a lot, and we passed a lot of schools, and I got to visit a lot of different places. And I ended up settling on William and Mary, but it's kind of a difficult process when you're not sure if you're good enough to be somewhere else, and you have to send out so many emails to so many different coaches. But it's really just all up to the individual. So I ended up like really getting into the recruiting process in 10th grade. I took the PSAT in 10th grade, which I think was a good kind of academic goal to show coaches and show your grades. And then I eventually took the SAT twice in 11th grade, once at the beginning and once in the end. My coach wanted, like the coach that I ended up really getting to know because he's my future college coach now. He told me like a certain goal that I needed to reach. So I was working really hard to meet that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mary, you brought up something, and thank you for sharing that, Mary. It's very helpful for our families here. Mary, you brought up something in particular for any of the families out there that have children that are involved in athletics and a part of the recruiting process. If you noticed, I noticed a phrase there that Mary used, and it really stood out to me. And it really, really shows the interest level to the coaches across the country from teenagers. She said, I contacted a lot of coaches. There were a lot of emails. There's a lot of communication, and she's initiating that. That self-advocacy is exactly what a lot of these coaches across the country look for. But as I told Mary, and I tell our students, even when I sit in our junior planning conferences, we as counselors work, no matter what level you're playing athletics at, no matter whether it's Division II full scholarship down to Division III, no matter what level you're playing at, no matter what, you're still going to have to go through the admissions office. And that's part of these webinars and part of this process. I don't want to give any of the parents out there the impression that, oh, if my kid's really, really good at a sport, I don't have to worry about any of his college planning. It'll just work itself out. No, to Mary's point, depending upon what schools you're looking to go to, they're going to have certain expectations that you meet for the admissions. On the other side of that, our parents ask me all the time, well, Mr. Findor, if my son or daughter is just the best in the state and the best in the Northeast United States and the best here, the best there, aren't they going to have just a way better chance of getting in? Not necessarily. It's really dependent upon the institution. Will they maybe they'll be a little bit more flexible. Maybe the student will have to do a summer program that all the other students didn't have to do to potentially get in. But I don't want to give the impression to everybody that that's always the case. Sometimes that could be a real myth. And when we're talking about that part of the process. But Mary, thank you. You said it really well for student athletes out there. And I can't stress this enough when I talk to Mary's parents. The communication should be coming from the student, right? From the athlete themselves. Should parents be involved in that process? Absolutely. Just like anything we're discussing today. Parents should absolutely be involved in the communications. But you as parents out there, you should not be 100% filling out all the applications for your child, right? There's a certain level of responsibility that they have to have. And communication is important, but it shouldn't be all one-sided. So as everybody has noticed, I've saved Meg for last, right, Meg? So here's the deal, Meg. I think I've complimented you. Meg, you have done an absolutely positively impressive ability to transfer into our school and really start to fit in from day one. You really were able to get yourself involved. You were able to join different activities, quickly met a lot of friends, and was really able to open yourself up and be a little bit vulnerable in a new situation coming from a completely different state and really allow for that. Meg, I'd like you to talk to 2 points here. The first one is just what was that transfer experience like for you? Going from your old school and telling everyone where you were coming from to your new school and what the different cultures look like. And then also, Meg, if you don't mind also describing, and I know at your old school, it might've been very early in the process, but was there any experience with college planning at that point? And then how did it carry over into the point of me bothering you all the time and making sure you're squared away? So talk to me about those 2 points, if you don't mind, Meg.
Absolutely. So I moved right in the summer before my junior year from Northern Virginia. So just about an hour outside of DC, from a little town called Warrenton, Virginia. And I went to Kettle Run High School. I was actually really involved my first 2 years of high school. I played violin in the orchestra. I played tennis, all 4 years actually of my high school experience. And yeah, I would say definitely it was a big change to come from Kettle Run to Unionville. But I'm really thankful that I'm here now. So actually the day I moved, June 13th, 2021, I still remember it because I actually got to meet the whole tennis team the exact same day that I moved, which is great because I would definitely say Unionville is a very tight-knit community. And it was fantastic to meet everyone. Academically, definitely, I'd say I didn't want to stress myself out last year or this year, but I still challenged myself and was really happy with like AP classes and things like that, but also taking time to balance life with outside orchestras and friends and kind of like the social life as well. So yeah, with college, I also am a violinist, so I had to audition just like Maddie to a bunch of different schools. so the process there was actually interesting because I visited a lot of schools, but I actually only ended up applying to 3 or 4, and they actually auditioning at 3. So those were Gettysburg, Delaware, and Westchester. So all very different schools, like size wise, program wise. So it was like interesting that way too. But yeah, definitely I'd say with the audition process and the college process, definitely what everyone's been saying, get as early as possible, because like even with tennis too, in the fall, it's definitely easier to get the essays done and the applications done as soon as possible. That way like you can enjoy your senior year and kind of balance everything else.
So Meg, you said it perfectly, in my opinion. I mean, and you're going to see everybody nodding their heads in the background. It's very easy to say, but difficult to do. When you brought up, you're trying to balance that time, right? When your time management portion of things, where you do not want to overwhelm yourself. What I always tell families when we're having these discussions, and we talk about it a lot, and everyone in the community here has seen it, right, from individuals who've been through this experience. That senior year, in particular, the fall, it's almost like having an entire class in itself on your schedule. That's just college applications, depending upon what the circumstance is for the student and how many schools they're applying to. So you have this very unique situation where you want to put your best foot forward and show the colleges that you are challenging yourself, but at the same time, you do not want to overwhelm yourself. And what I share with students is that you really have to, if anything, I find myself a lot as a counselor, potentially scaling students back a little bit. For their senior year in particular, when it comes to that portion of things, because they have to add in that added time of potentially doing college applications. The last thing you would want is to have a senior that's completely overwhelmed. You only get one senior year in high school, as all of you can remember in the community. The last thing you want to do is be overwhelmed and completely stressed out for your entire senior year and not enjoying it. Because if you are overwhelmed and if you overschedule yourself and if you take too many classes at too much of a rigorous standpoint that are too time consuming, that's going to have a ripple effect, not just on your classes and the potential first marking period grades and mid-year grades, that the whole point of this is what you wanted to improve. It potentially is going to have a backfire effect and your grades might not be improved, but it's also going to affect your relationship with your friends. It's going to affect the relationship with your family and those around you, let alone your mental health in itself. So Meg, I'm really happy you brought up that point, and you have such a unique experience coming from a different school district, kind of halfway through high school there, that you're able to speak to that balancing act that you're trying to do with everything you're involved in. So what I'd like to do now is I would like to just touch on a couple points on what we're getting some of the questions in from the chat, if everybody doesn't mind. One of the first things that I'd like to address that's kind of coming up in a couple of the questions, I brought it up just a little bit earlier about kind of what's the expectations for documentation for these applications, right? What's the expectations from the student side of things, from the parent side of things, and then from the counselor side of things of what we're submitting? Again, this is where I'm going to start off, and I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, and at times parents want to pull their hair out, but this can look very, very different depending upon the institution. Where I can ease your mind a little bit is what I said earlier. These institutions are going to be very, very clear on their admissions website of what the expectations are. General rule of thumb, the larger institutions that are going to be self-reporting are going to start as early as August 1st. The institutions that are going to have early action deadlines, right? There was a question in the chat about what's the timeline for these different deadlines. Essentially, rolling admissions. Larger schools can start in the summer because they don't need letters of recommendation and transcripts from us as counselors. So the student and the families provide a lot of information. That can start as early as summer. The next deadline that would potentially come up would be an early action deadline. Early action essentially just means that it's just an early deadline. It could be October 15th, November 1st. And usually those early action deadlines, they're allowing you to know what your answer is going to be to the school by December or middle December and so on and so forth. The next start of what some of the students end up applying, this is always a very dangerous one that I spend some time discussing with families, is early decision. Early decision. I see Mary shaking her head. Early decision is a binding commitment. It's a binding commitment that student is making to that institution. You can only do it for one institution. You can apply early decision to one school. And essentially what you're saying is the student would sign off on an early decision form, parent would sign off, I would even sign off as a counselor, admissions rep would sign off, and we're all signing off on very early in the process. If that student gets into that school, that's where they're going, pending some financial crisis in their family. And we always encourage students, even if you're applying early decision to that one school, and you won't see too many schools offering that even as an option, but even if you're applying early decision at one school, still apply to all these other schools in case you don't get into that early decision school. Where I always encourage families in the community, just be very, very careful of falling into the trap of applying early decision to a school just because you notice on their admissions website, it gives your child a better chance of getting into that school. Because if your child is applying early decision at school and they're still on the fence about a couple other schools that they've applied to, once teenagers start to hear back from all these schools, trust me, their mind can change from minute to minute, if you haven't already noticed in some of the conversations we've had in here. So making that binding commitment is a very big responsibility for a family to take on. But that would be early decision. And then after that, essentially regular decision, if you see that on any of the applications. We try to avoid that if it's possible, because regular decision is not until January 1st or January 15th. And that's later in the process. And typically, the chances to get in school just lower a little bit as you apply a little bit later at that point, because schools know pretty much what their timeframes or what their numbers are going to be and what that's going to look like. Two other points that I want to bring up, and Meg's kind of at this point talking about still making a decision a little bit later in the process. That's okay. I tell that to students all the time. Do not fall into the trap, right? You'll start to have all these schools getting back to you after early action, or maybe they deferred you and they got your mid-year grades. And now all of a sudden, you're hearing back from a lot of schools and you're hearing back from more and more that they accepted you. At that point, your attitude might change about where you stand in the process. Like I said before to Mrs. Day, I understand it's time, it's money, it's resources, but you can go visit the school a second time. When you go view that school a second time after you've been accepted, your perception now changes. There's no longer, what would this look like if I got in? Now you got in. And if it's down to 2 or 3 schools, when you visit them a second time, it's really going to educate yourself in a different manner. But that would typically happen a little bit later in the process. Again, outside of early decision, you don't have to take an acceptance until May 1st. So you have plenty of time. Where some of these colleges and universities will start to come in, and since I don't have any admissions reps in here, I'm going to kind of let it rip a little bit. What they tend to do to try to encourage you to make a decision sooner than later is they'll start to send you, oh, hey, listen, if you take your acceptance now and put down a deposit with us and take your acceptance, we'll give you priority housing. And I always tell families, just be very careful feeding into that, because you don't want to make a major decision for your future just based off if you're going to be a block closer to the campus. So being very careful about that is very important. One topic that I wanted to bring up for everybody, and again, I'm going to kind of bring it up to the group here, so don't fight over it here. But if any of you can kind of touch on utilizing Naviance and kind of what that looked like for you, or anything that was helpful in Naviance that you took a look at, even dating back to 9th, 10th grade, or anything that you worked with your children on, or students, anything that you've worked on in Naviance. If anybody doesn't mind opening that up to the community, we had just 1 or 2 questions about Naviance in here.
Well, I'll start as a parent, and definitely a parent who was, especially with my son, going through it. I think I was on Naviance the second I could get on Naviance, right? He's like, here's his grades, here's what I hope his SATs are. But it actually is a really good guide, right? And especially when you're saying, okay, where can my child go? And when you're done with your junior year, we use that a lot. So you're picking out, okay, I'm going to apply these 10, 12 schools. Well, what's my likelihood of getting in? And they really were pretty accurate, honestly. There's ebbs and flows, don't get me wrong, but the reality of the situation, it really felt like it guided us. I'll give you an example. University of Texas was the only school my son really got full on rejected to. And it basically said he wasn't going to get in, right? And then all the other schools were like, yeah, you're a good shot to get in. I would learn it. I would really get to know it. It is really beneficial. Start putting your favorite schools, in their junior year, like, hey, look, I looked this school up. Looks like a nice one. Put it as a favorite. And you edit that list as the years go on. It's a really great tool.
Yeah, Mrs. Frey, you brought up a really good point there. Again, it's a starting point. As you mentioned, it's a nice starting point, gives a lot of information. Some of the tools that we utilize in Naviance, and again, parents, I don't want to overwhelm you. We discuss all of this in junior planning conferences in a little bit more detail, but just to save some time tonight, when we start to look at what we call the scattergrams in Naviance, what that information is providing is students from Unionville High School that were accepted to particular schools and not accepted. And that information's on there from about the last almost decade now, I believe. It's again, it's not 100% perfect, but it's a nice starting point. Where there's some complications in there is it may not take in specific majors, right? So for particular schools, some majors might be a lot more selective to get into. I'll give you an example that we just brought up earlier today. Right down the road, I discussed with the admissions from Westchester University for years. They had a certain level of expectation for students to get in for the majority of their majors. However, their nursing program was extremely, extremely selective in that they were only taking about 75 students out of potentially 35 or 4,000 kids. That is extremely selective. So the GPA and the SATs necessary for that were a lot higher. Naviance didn't necessarily indicate that. But what I do tell families, if you run into that particular situation, college admissions have come a long way on their websites. They are typically going to indicate that on their admissions website, because trust me, families contact them all the time and with those exact questions, and they're trying to get out in front of that to avoid a lot of questions. So they're going to put on there, if there are particular majors that the institution has that are going to be a lot more selective than the vast majority of the other majors, they're usually going to indicate that on their admissions website. We have a question in the chat here that kind of ties into that, asking about the acceptance rates for the different schools, and how accurate are they? What does that look like? Again, this is one of those where I am not trying to cause more anxiety here in these webinars, but I'm just trying to be as honest as possible. When you talk about these different institutions, especially since the pandemic, and as you can see, some of the individuals in here talking about how things have changed, and more importantly, also discussing, there was a number of students that ended up taking a gap year a year or two ago, and I'm finding more students still taking gap years. That can fluctuate a lot of the admissions numbers. And I can't give you a black and white answer on what that looks like for all these institutions. But what I tell students and families in our junior planning conference, and at times what's very difficult to hear, and I don't take it lightly when I say this, as much as you can remove the personal aspect of it, as much as you can remove the personal aspect of it and understand at times this might be more of a numbers game. If they get an additional 5,000 applicants for some of these schools in a particular major, they could make their GPAs much more selective to get in, and their potential SATs and ACTs. Along with that, schools, and if you go back to our second webinar there on our counseling center website, we talked a lot about going test optional for SAT and ACT. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You can go right on our counseling center website and find out exactly what we were discussing for it. But what's also come upon a lot of schools that I'm finding, that is also fluctuating numbers for particular schools, where a student might have only applied to 6 or 8 schools in the past, and they thought, oh, my SATs or my ACTs were maybe not quite what I wanted them to be. Well, now that a lot of schools are test optional, they're saying, hey, I might as well throw my hat in the ring and end up applying to more schools to see if I could potentially get in, because I do not have to submit my SATs or ACTs. So we're seeing a little bit of that has to, kind of change things around for some of the application numbers and the acceptance rate. And again, it's very difficult for me to sit across the desk from across my office from a family where I'm looking at students that have tried to do everything perfectly right along the entire process. And for me to tell them, try not to make this personal, it's a very complicated thing to happen. But you're going to find out, and if you notice on the admissions websites for the different schools, they try to show as much as they can any trends to inform parents as much as they possibly can. On the heels of that, we had a nice question in here that I get all the time. Do we have a registration code for parents? At this point, since the pandemic, we've been having such a difficult time with working with Naviance and getting everything squared away from having a parent account. We just encourage all the parents. There's nothing necessarily too confidential that should be in a Naviance account. Just utilize your child's Naviance account when you're using it. Another question that we have in the chat that I want to open up to everybody, and students, parents, anybody can answer this one, because I know a lot of you probably had to utilize this at some point, is to discuss the Common App, right? And what is the Common App? What purpose does it serve? The Common Application. Can anybody just talk a little bit about the Common App and what it looked like from your perspective?
I can talk about Common App.
Thank you, ma'am.
I liked it because it was fairly easy. My counselors got access to all the schools that were on there, and they were on top of it as much as I was. You go through the Common App and you answer a round of questions about, do you want to live on campus? What do you want to do? Like family status, all this stuff, like are there alumni in your family? And then it gets repetitive, but it's the nice amount of repetitive where you can crank out. I was able to crank out 3-4 college applications a day because I knew how I was answering these questions. And it also gave me a good perspective on how like my counselors were really on top of it too, because I submit a Common App and then right away I submit my pink form, and then automatically that school is saying the next day that my counselors already sent in my letters of recommendation and my transcript. So it was really nice because the counselors have like the same amount of viewing you do on the Common App, and it's just, it makes it so much easier to apply to things.
Yeah, Megan, thank you. And for some of the parents in the panel and some of the parents out in the community, if you can remember applying to schools years ago, I always jokingly say, and the parents start laughing, it's shocking to students for them to comprehend that years ago you used to have to take all of your information and mail it directly to each institution, and that's how time consuming that can be. Now here's this program, the Common Application, where you could essentially upload your essays, your extracurriculars, your honors, all the information that would typically go onto an application can get uploaded on the Common Application. And again, I'm not going to get too much detail on this. We have our senior seminar presentation on the Counseling Center website that really walks through the specifics of this. But essentially what Megan's referring to is once the student starts their profile, and again, you can start that as early as August 1st, your profile for the Common Application. Once the student starts that profile and they start working on some of their applications through the Common App, the student we're allowed as counselors to then link up the Naviance program we have at Unionville High School. We're allowed to link up the Naviance program to the Common App, and that allows us to have access to a lot of information they're working on, and we can start to see whether or not they submitted their application in Common App. And things such as letters of recommendation. Letters of recommendation are typically going to come from the Naviance program from us. The teachers upload them into Naviance, and then we as counselors have access to be able to send them to the different schools. The only time you're really going to use the Common Application for any letters of recommendation would be if you were getting a letter of recommendation from someone outside of the staff of UHS. So in the past, I've had individuals who had students who had full-time jobs, students that, work closely with TCHS, all different types of individuals outside the community. The student can request that individual's letter of recommendation through the Common Application, and then it sits in their portal in the Common App, and they're able to also helpfully access that application to send the letter of recommendation through the Common App. We as counselors have access through Naviance to the letters of recommendation. When we discuss letters of recommendation, I want to be very clear about this. The typical time frame for letters of recommendation, you're going to see a decent portion of schools that are going to ask for 2 teachers. It could vary on what those teachers might be. I've had engineering students that and students going into different sciences where they particularly ask for a math and a science teacher for their letters of recommendation. But the vast majority of schools you're going to end up seeing, they usually want 2 teachers and a counselor. And usually the traditional route would be getting those letters of recommendation from teachers in their junior year. It doesn't have to be, but usually from the junior, because by the time those admissions individuals are receiving those letters of recommendation and the students beginning their senior year, that's kind of the most recent information from a well-rounded perspective that they're able to get their hands on. And so we encourage students, and again, we discussed this in the junior planning conferences, so don't feel like you have to remember all of this, down the road. We encourage students to start asking their teachers almost this time of year, typically February, March, April, and then essentially the teachers have the availability to work on those, which can be very time consuming for our teachers, work on those leading up into the fall when we start getting a lot of the applications out for some of the students. So that's kind of the time frame from that perspective of letters of recommendation. Another point that I want to bring up that Megan brought up to everybody, you may hear some of these terms such as pink forms and some of the application forms that they have, just to kind of clear that up for a lot of our families. When you hear anyone mentioning the pink forms, and those of you with multiple children that came through, especially those of you that had children before the pandemic, you can remember the hard copy pink forms that were neon bright and blinding your eyes. What the pink forms essentially are is it's a college application document request form. And all that really is, that's the form that students are going to fill out for each individual school during their senior year. And then they're going to fill that out and hit submit. That form can look very different for each school, but that information essentially is going to dictate what information does the student need to provide to the school, to the college or university, and what information do I as a counselor need to provide to that school or that institution. That pink form is going to drive the information getting out to the college or university. You might say, but Mr. Findora, how do you know what that information should be? Again, I know I sound like a broken record. The admissions website is going to tell you exactly what they want, when they want it, and how they want it. That admissions website is going to drive those pink forms, those college document request forms that the students fill out their senior years. Okay. I'm going to open up another question to some of the families here. And this is a little more broad question. Some of you touched on it a little bit earlier, but what was your experiences, if you don't mind sharing, what was your experiences going on the college visits? What did that look like? Was it difficult to get out to different schools? And just follow up on that part of the process, if anybody wouldn't mind sharing.
For us, it was a really positive experience. And to be honest, we sort of started that process, if we were traveling when Maddie was in her sophomore year, we would try to add a college visit in there. And not all of those schools, she ended up applying to. But I think as much information as you can get on a website, that's great. But being on campus, seeing the kids, it's just a completely different experience. And there were a few schools that Madeline was dead set on applying to, and she visited campus and she said, nope, this isn't it. And then has had the opposite experience where she just connected with a particular campus. So for us, if you can make it, it's a real positive.
Yeah, that's great.
I was going to second that. I would have to say that the schools that we were able to go see, the impression that it made on my daughter was really, really strong. And I don't know that she had any idea that it would help her as much as it did to walk the campuses and even to drive as far as Vermont and realize that you're that far away from home for her was helpful. She realized that she actually didn't want to be that far away, even though she liked the campus. There were things that she liked about the different schools. But I think that, like I said, I think seeing it while students are active and recognizing, is this school in session year round? If you go in the summer, are you going to get a picture of the school in action? Does the school have summer stuff going on, or is the school quiet? And I would urge people to see the school when it's in action, in particular, if you can, and so that you can bump into students and possibly attend a class, or just see how everybody interacts and feel the vibe on the campus. I think that meant a lot to my daughter to feel that at different schools. So I would suggest that. I also think if you can do that before senior year, before you're applying to 10 or 12 schools or more, I teach a lot of seniors, and I have in my time at Unionville. And it seems like there is an increasing amount of stress on seniors because they haven't quite honed what they want, and they're going to do these visits, these accepted student visits in the end of their senior year. And it can add a whole layer of stress if they're a student who also has a challenging schedule and APs coming up. And now they're trying to visit the schools and walk the schools. And so the more of that you can do in the summer of your junior year, I think all of that is a great, great investment, rather than sort of applying to a big pile and then having to go walk campuses and sort it out while you're trying to wrap up your senior year. Because I think there's a lot to enjoy at this time of year as a senior.
Yeah,
Can I add to that, Mr. Findora, really quickly?
Please.
We actually used spring break junior year.
Yeah.
We thought Caitlin wanted to go south. We went to Georgia, Texas, Florida, Alabama, any school, and she's ending up at Penn State, which is ironic. But she got to see. But your kid knows the second they walk on that campus. Listen to them, watch them, listen to the questions they're asking the tour guides. It's really going to drive what they know. I will, one school Caitlin walked on and we were there for an hour. She's like, this is not it. I'm like, okay, let's go. Next one. So really listen to your child, because they know they have this feel. It's like, it's innate, and they know exactly where they should be.
That's a great point. It's a great point. Mary, not to put you on the spot, but with the athletic portion of things and going on visits, maybe potentially meeting with coaches while you get to see the school. What did that look like for you?
Yeah, so with the emailing process and then like eventually calling coaches, it's a lot different because there's only like there's a certain amount of time where you're not able to actually talk to the coach on the phone. They're not able to respond to you. So I end up making a lot of calls basically this summer before my junior year and during my junior year, and then eventually deciding on like places where I wanted to go visit.
Yep.
So I had like 2 different visits in mind, kind of back to back, with Butler, which is in Indiana,
Yep.
and William and Mary. And I ended up canceling my Butler visit because I was already really like this. I completely decided.
Yep.
And it's a lot more different, I think, because you get to meet a team and you get to meet a different environment. I actually never have walked into a university building yet anywhere. So I think it's going to be a really big adjustment still, but getting to meet a team rather than meeting like students, it's a really different experience, and you get to know people a lot more that way.
Yeah, that's great. Meg or Megan, if you don't mind sharing anything about your experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of going off of what Mary said, so Widener was actually the last college I applied to. I had a section in the fall where I really just applied to every college I wanted to go to, and I didn't apply to Widener until about 2-3 months ago even. So I heard back pretty fast, and then I decided to go to their accepted science students day, which really clicked for me. Because I went on a general tour about a few weeks before, and then I decided to go to their science day. And I got to sit in on a biology class, which I've never been a science student, but I sat in that class and I was like, wow, like I could like be in this class. Like I don't I like can't not stand it. And I also got an hour block at the end of the tour to be able to pick where I wanted to go. Like they had guys everywhere. And I chose to go see the PT building, which if you are a person looking into PT, OT, whatever it is, or you have a child who's looking into it, seeing the PT building or the OT building or where they're going to have your specific major is so important. And that's what really sold me, because their PT building was up to date. They have great simulation labs. They have a brand new cadaver lab that's state of the art. And it was so convincing to me that I did what Mary did. I decided not to go to my other acceptance. I didn't go. I was like, this is where I want to be. I was surrounded by other people, especially girls in the PT pool too, that wanted to go there for physical therapy, and so much clicked for me there. But even with what Miss Ray was saying about how you don't know exactly what you want to do, so you're trying to tour all these colleges. For me, I wasn't a part of the recruitment process, but I knew I wanted to do at least like sideline cheerleading. So I would cheer on Friday night at a football game, and then Saturday morning I would find a local college. Like I went to Widener, I went to Lebanon Valley, I went to Duquesne, and I watched their cheerleading program to think, at least if I don't know what I want to do, I can see what I want to be involved in here. So if there's places that have like a performing arts program or an athletic program that you might be interested in, it helps to look there first if you don't know exactly what you want to do with your major. But definitely the specific days to your major, like the accepted science students day or education students day, that's what really sold me on mine. And having tour guides who are students in those programs, it sold me completely.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Megan, that's a great point that you brought up. That's and here's the thing, Megan. This is where it makes it a little complicated, and I'm just being honest with everyone. Depending upon the institution, and how many tours they're given and what that looks like, you might not get that quite as in-depth tour, especially if you're going there for a general tour. What that and how that could be a little bit different from college to college and the visits. Meg, if you don't mind sharing, talk a little bit about your experiences within college visits.
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely recommend visiting all sorts of colleges more than once too. I found like things like weather, season, things like that also kind of persuade me one way or another. So it's good to see the campus in like different lights. Definitely meeting people is really important. So like for music kids, especially, like try to go to rehearsals. Another important thing is to like most professors provide like free lessons or like studio classes where you can just kind of sit in and meet everyone and kind of like hear how they sound. So I definitely think that's important. And then another thing with visiting is on weekends too, because you kind of want to see if a lot of kids stick around campus or if they, things like that. So I would definitely say that.
So Meg just took one of the points that I wanted to bring up right out of my mouth. Meg, I appreciate that. On top of things as always. Yeah, listen, this is what I always share with parents. This is the tough part about it. Here we are talking about how valuable this experience is, but where do you fit it in, right? And we talk about how I have to be careful what I say here, just in case Dr. Sandville is going to be listening to this webinar. But I always jokingly used to say to families, when we used to have before COVID, before we had the FID days, I was just jokingly say to families, you can plan your vacations, you can plan your college trips during that spring break, because I feel like our community is so invested in that time during spring break that they're always going to add the snow days to the summertime, and they're never going to touch that spring break because how valuable that time is for our community members and the commitments that they make to travel all over the place to see these colleges. And it's very valuable. But to Meg's point, it's one of these deals where you can always visit on weekends. You can always visit during the summer. I always tell parents, listen, if you're visiting and you're just traveling through a particular area for vacation, and maybe your child's in 10th grade, or, I wouldn't go too much younger than that, but you want to just see the school and see what it looks like, but you don't have the time to do an official tour. I always tell them, have your child contact that admissions office and ask them just the very basics. Hey, listen, we're not able to do a tour. We're going to be traveling through. Would there be any recommendations that you would make for us to check out? And that's twofold. First of all, you're going to get good information that you wouldn't have from before. And the second part of it is they track interest. So they'll keep track of that email down the road, and they're going to keep an eye on that. Not that that's going to make or break an application, but it can only help. The other part that I bring up is for some families, it's not always easy. Parents taking off work to necessarily travel during spring break for whatever reasons. Hey, listen, the students get 3 excused absences their junior year. They get 3 excused absences their senior year. Now, I want to be very clear about this to everyone. We have to be careful utilizing those absences, as the students in the chat here, or I'm sorry, in the webinar know. You miss one day in some of these very intense, rigorous courses, it feels like you missed a week. So you don't want to necessarily overwhelm yourself, but you do have access to those absences. The last point, and Mrs. Ferrer brought up a really nice point about really trying to have that wide net and check out all these schools all over the place as much as you possibly can. I always tell families, listen, your child can always apply to a school that they have not visited. Trust me, if you get in, they'll do everything possible to get you on that campus. But you can apply that school and kind of let the dice roll, and then find out if you get in. And then once you get in, then you can rearrange your opportunities that you have to go visit that school and then get your feet on the campus later on. If it's difficult to get out to the different schools, I'm finding a lot of our students applying down south, and a lot of our students even applying out towards Colorado. And some of them just simply, they don't have the time to fly and have the resources to make that happen before they get into their senior year. You can always still apply. But trust me, as you're seeing the theme here, and that's why I brought it up a second time about the visits. But in the end, you're going to want to get your feet on those campuses before you take any acceptance. So I'd like to touch on a couple more points here before we wrap things up. One of the questions that we were able to get in the chat kind of ties into something we deal a lot with in the counseling center about the letters of recommendation we discussed a little bit earlier. Yes, that you're correct. A lot of times parents are confused in the community because they're saying, well, Mr. Findora, you as counselors and the teachers aren't really processing those letters of recommendation until the start of the student's senior year. What about those schools that you just got done talking about that students are allowed to apply to as early as August? Those schools that open up their applications in August, those really large schools, the Penn States, the Pitts, they're going to have big bold letters on their admissions website telling you, if you're applying to our main campus applications, we do not want letters of recommendation. They have 30, 40,000 students applying. They're not reading letters of recommendation. So they're going to be clear about that. So that allows the process to start earlier in the summer so the application can start, because they essentially do not need anything from the counselors. The vast majority of all the other documentation I brought up earlier, that's going to be necessary. And the students are going to be aware of their expectations during the senior seminars and the senior conference. And we clear all of that up with them during that process. Another question that we got into the chat here, and I would love to hear from some of the parents about this one. One of the questions was for the parents that have older children that are in college. What was the adjustment like with the younger children that are on pace to potentially apply or that have applied? what did that process look like for any of you that are kind of in that world where either your child, you did have a second child that applied, or you have one coming up? What's the expectations?
I'll do it because I have a sophomore and a senior, right? So, watching Colin go to school for Caitlin, it was good and bad. She was the only child. But when it started coming to applying to schools, I honestly think it drove her to the larger schools, right? She watched her brother go to a large school. And so she realized that, hey, you know what? He loves it there. They have a big football game every weekend. They have fraternities, sororities. They have every club you could imagine. And so it really kind of drove her to a larger school, which is very interesting because it's something you have to decide on your own. Like as a parent, you're kind of like, hey, gave her the same options, looked at smaller schools, looked at bigger schools. But I think having an older sibling who's loving the school, even, again, you never know where your kid is going to go. And that's my biggest advice to everyone. But really watching, one of your children go off and the one that's left at home, watching and say, wow, I want that too. So that led to Caitlin to only apply to business schools as well as large schools.
Yeah, great. All right, so I'd like to bring up another point here that we discussed a little bit earlier. When we talk about when we're starting to discuss the application process and what that looks like, this is a little bit of a broader question here, a little more vague here, but anything you would change, any of you in here, students, parents, anything you would have did a little bit differently, or anything you might have shifted around a little bit. I don't want to say any do nots that you want to provide to the families out there. We're providing a lot of what to do. Anything that you would give advice on potentially to try to stay away from, or anything that's a little bit more open-ended?
I just had one thing, since my daughter had to change gears, because I felt at first you have no way of knowing when your child changes their mind about this after all the time that you put into searching for colleges and helping guide them. And I really let her make a lot of the decisions herself. She's very independent in her thinking. So I didn't want to overlay any of my process or my husband's process on her. So we gave her all the opportunities, and she decided to go test optional. We gave her a lot of opportunities to see schools, and she decided to only apply to a few. I felt guilty when she changed her mind, because I felt like we had somehow failed her in choosing a school or helping her find a school. But what actually came out of it was, like, the more time that goes on, and I see where she is now, and she's working full time, and she's a student at Westchester. She loves the education program at Westchester, and that's all she ever wanted, was a program that, like, an education program that was really strong, and that turned out to be around the corner. But I was feeling really guilty that we didn't look more carefully at the makeup of, in our case, it was Bloomsburg, but we didn't realize that a lot of the campus goes home on the weekends. So 70% of that campus doesn't live on campus. And she realized it right away after we left. It felt so different to her. And we had no way of knowing that, because our first visits, it was during the summer, and they don't have a summer program. And even during accepted students time, it was after the spring semester had ended. So yeah. I had imagined what it might be like if the campus was really vibrant, but I had no way of knowing what it was really like when she started there. And that's why my biggest piece of advice is just going to be to try to get in there and let your student get the vibe while it's like in action. Yeah. And that's, sorry if I've already said that.
No, that's good. No, Mrs. That's great advice and different perspective. I really appreciate you being open about that. Anybody else that kind of what they would do a little differently, or any advice they would be able to give?
So mine's sort of general, but as I said, Maddie's application process was pretty involved. Yeah. And I think early on in the fall, it kind of took over. Yeah. And, Tom, my husband and I, we had to be conscious of not having every conversation be about college applications. So we shifted gears and then just started making like a Sunday appointment to kind of regroup and talk about stuff, so that we were also aware that we have 1 year left, and we don't want it to be consumed by stressful stuff, because these kids get really stressed. So just don't let it take over. And we kind of did for a little while and had to recalibrate. So
Yeah, Mrs. Day, it's hard not to. That's really, really good advice. I've even had sit down with students this time of year, which is very complicated for some of our seniors, right? In that if they haven't made their decision yet, and they're one student or two students at their lunch table and everybody's talking about so on and so forth, still trying to make their decisions. I've had some meetings with some students and telling them, hey, let's walk through what you're going to say to your friends, or what you're going to say to your friends' parents when you go over, right? Because it's natural for a parent of a friend just to want to have a conversation, say, oh, what's updated with that? How are you doing? Where does it go? Innocent enough, not knowing that stress that might potentially cause for students all along the process as they go through. So that's really good advice. Not to put any of the students on the spot here, although I promised you for the last week I wouldn't do that, but I'm going to here. Anything that any of you would do differently, or just any advice you would give for any of the community here as we kind of start to somewhat wrap things up? Anything you would give advice on about the college process?
I just want to say like two things. First, like on your point, what you just said about like when all your friends are going to college and some people aren't, like when I have friends over at my house and I'm already, a committed student, my parents keep asking people like, where are you going to school? And I'm like, nobody knows yet. So just relax and don't worry about it. Don't pester people. It stresses them out. I feel bad. And then the second thing I wanted to just remind people about is since it's like March 22nd, I remember last year I needed to tell my teachers or ask them for recommendations by spring break for some of them. So just make sure your students, or if you are students, just ask your teachers for those recommendations soon if you're a junior.
Yeah, Mary, that's great advice. I know we kind of touched on the recommendations earlier, but you're right, because some teachers teach the majority of juniors, and the writing letters of recommendation can be extremely time consuming for the teachers. The more they're able to have that information a little bit earlier in the process, especially when we line up our junior planning conferences, the more they're able to map out what the expectations are and set aside time for that. But now, Mary, thank you for providing some of that feedback. Meg or Megan, not to put you in the spot, but anything else that either of you wanted to add about differently in the process at all, or anything advice?
Kind of coming from the other perspective of what Mary was saying, like there's so much comparison when it comes to college applications, but like you have to remember there's always going to be someone going to an Ivy League, and there's always going to be someone playing the same sport as you that might be going D1 when you're going D3. And it's honestly not that big of a deal. When it comes down to it, I know for me personally, I was never a standardized test person. So I was comparing myself so much with these people who were getting almost 1600s on their SAT and a perfect score on their ACT. Yeah. And I'm sitting here like, what am I doing wrong? I go to the same school. I'm in the same classes as these people. Why don't I get it like they get it? And I kind of realized that like, it didn't matter at the end of the day, because I think the SAT and the ACT are great for figuring out where you place and like how well you've learned and stuff. But I went test optional to every single school, and I still got into every single school I applied to. Yep. And at the end of the day, I stretched myself so thin when it came to comparing myself to where people are going, what sport they're playing, how they did on all these things, to the point where I didn't focus on what I wanted to do. I was focused on what other people wanted to do. So keep it about yourself, and then don't think about what other people are doing, because you graduate and then you might not ever see these people again. So comparing yourself now does not help you in the long run.
Yeah, Megan, I appreciate you sharing some personal information there. It's super helpful for, especially the students out in the community here, to hear it firsthand from you. I really appreciate you sharing that. And Megan, to your point, we had on Mr. Salmon from Johns Hopkins, echoing exactly your words. Here's the admissions rep for that school telling you, don't necessarily think just because we're a highly selective school that we're necessarily going to have a particular program that might be better than everywhere else, right? Asking those questions from the institutions. I always share with families, one of the big things that I like to talk about is, especially when you go on your visits, find out what kind of internships are the majors getting? What kind of job placement rates do they have for these different majors? What does it look like when the student gets into their junior and their senior year, about lining them up for once they graduate and setting that expectation that there's going to be a job waiting for them and how to get that job? It's such an important piece of the puzzle. Not quite as much what kind of sticker is going to be slapped on the back of an SUV, right, to say, well, or what sweatshirt's being worn. It's not quite as much about that. Shifting that focus can be difficult at times, and can really complicate things. Anyone else before I kind of move on to the last thing for the night? So, all right. So listen, this is going to hopefully, I expect some of you to have a little bit of deer in headlights look on this one, coming from me. It's not personal on my side of things, and it's also important for our counseling department. I want you to take a step back here, and I want you to think about, is there anything that you could think of that maybe we could shift our focus on a little bit more in the counseling department, and give some feedback to us on, hey, is there anything we can spend a little more time on that might be helpful? Is there anything that we can spend a little less time on? Any feedback that you could provide to me to help adjust how we do things in the department. Trust me, all of you, I'm asking that in a very open public forum because I'm confident in my job. So please, I really do want the feedback from any of you on the panel. Any advice you would give or anything that I could try to bring back to the team and bring back to our administration and start to work on that you'd be able to provide?
I'll actually give you a little bit of advice.
There we go. President, I knew you were going to hold back on me.
No, but you were fabulous. And thank you. You're definitely our guiding light for both my children. But, you know, the one thing that confused me were the damn pink sheets. I just didn't know when did we fill them out? And especially the large schools, like you mentioned, you know, you could fill out all the applications, get it done. But then all of a sudden I'm like, wait a second, we need a pink sheet. And I remember doing it with Colin. He literally had the pink sheet. Completely forgot about that process with Caitlin. So just maybe making sure that we understand like when to fill out, or the kids understand when to fill out. Maybe before senior year, maybe in the junior planning conference. I know you talked about, but just emphasize it a little more.
Great. No, Ms. Ferrer, that's wonderful feedback. And you're not the first parent that's brought that up to me. So I really appreciate that, and reevaluating how we deliver that information is important, because that can be confusing. And to your point, it's a very important document. Right. This is clarifying what the expectations are on both sides of the fence to making sure this information is accurate. I'm being very honest with everyone. The reason within the pink forms that we asked for 10 school days prior to a deadline, because I processed over 500 applications for just my seniors alone. When we're processing all the information, it can be overwhelming for us when we get closer to larger deadlines where the vast majority of schools are coming up. We need that information to be accurate. So the sooner the better, and communication above all else is clear about those. So yeah, Ms. Ferrer, I appreciate you sharing that, and for us to take a look into delivering that information more clearly about what the expectations are before the students get into their senior year. Thank you. Anybody else before we start to wrap things up here? No brave souls for me.
Wait, I just want to echo the thanks, because I can't think of anything that the counseling department could have done better for my senior in so many ways. They supported her from the start of her freshman year straight through her senior year, and she took some unusual paths, you know, like to head off towards TCHS her senior year. She had to adjust to make sure she could finish her courses properly. And there was just so much care to her as an individual. She was always treated as an individual, even at the point where we found out that she was going to come home and she was going to be applying to schools again. The counseling department reached out to say, can we help her get where she needs to be? And so there was like this standing offer for her. I can't think of anything else, Bobby.
No, thank you.
We appreciate you.
Thank you. Anything from any of the students before we start to finish things up here? All right, everybody. All right. So listen, I stressed it in the beginning of this webinar. I'll stress it again. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the parents. Thank you to the students. You know, without all of you participating in this, and I know for some of you, I hopefully it wasn't too scary for you, and it's exactly how I described it. Again, this is such a different kind of thing. I'm in communication with high schools all across southeastern Pennsylvania and their counseling departments. This is something that I wanted to put together for a long time. It's just getting the right pieces and the right people, and all of you were a perfect fit for tonight to provide such a different perspective on the different avenues. And this was difficult for me to get together. For the last 2 years, I've really wanted to try to do this. And I'm very appreciative that all of you were able to be a little bit vulnerable tonight to provide some information to our families and be able to guide them along. Because again, it's nice for them to hear from these admissions representatives in my prior 2 webinars, but to hear it directly from all of you and firsthand experiences from students, kind of like what Meg brought up earlier, from students that are a part and parents that are part of a tight-knit community. You know, it's very helpful for them. I'd like to thank again, Justin Webb, our technology guru there, allowing us to provide all of this. Again, Justin provides me with the recording for this, so I'll have it up on the counseling website, hopefully by the beginning of next week, if not by the end of the week. And you'll be able to go through. And again, if I kept referencing our prior webinars about test optional, financial aid, highly selective schools, all these different topics we brought up throughout tonight, you can go back to those other webinars and see the exact information that was provided in a nice presentation from the admission representatives on that. As far as moving forward, like I always share with the community, please, if you have questions, concerns, reach out to your counselors, let them know of anything that you may have that might be helpful. And then last, I'd also like to thank Mrs. Allbrand and Mrs. Elfrith behind the scenes here with our webinars to be able to help facilitate a lot of our questions and get everything taken care of tonight. So as I wrap things up, one last thank you to all the parents, one last thank you to all the students. I'll be in touch again for another set of thank yous. And thank you all out in the community. I really appreciate all of your participation and your involvement in our counseling department and involvement in these webinars. Thank you very much.